This video covers doing numeric summaries for quantitative data. So remember, whenever you want to think about summarizing data, which is a key component of doing statistics, the first thing that you should really consider is really what kind of data do I have? And so we've already covered dealing with categorical data and how to summarize that numerically and graphically. Numerically, we just used frequency tables or contingency tables, and then we used bar plots for the most part for graphs. What we're going to cover in this video are just the numeric summaries associated with quantitative variables. Quantitative variables are ones where you can add and subtract them or just basically do math on them, and it makes sense. So something like zip code, even though they're numeric, you can't do math on zip codes. You can't add two zip codes and get something meaningful. So that's not quantitative. But something like time until something is done, time is something you can do math on, and that makes sense. How do we do numerical summaries for these quantitative variables? Well, if we have a single variable, the things that we tend to look at are measures of center and spread. And so really what we're doing here is trying to describe the distribution or aspects of the distribution of that variable. So when you think about a variable, in statistics, we're dealing with random variables, so there's variation within those variables, and so there's a distribution associated with them. And this distribution just defines the pattern and frequency with which you observe it. And commonly we want to talk about the center of that distribution, i.e. on average maybe, where do you get values, and then what value gives me 50% above and below. Those would be the mean and median. And then measures of spread, variance, standard deviation, etc. When we start talking about having two variables, the major things that we look at would be measures of linear relationship. So covariance and correlation give us measures of linear relationships. And what we're going to do at the end is just look at how we can do any of those things above for subgroups of our data. And that's really where we want to end up heading. Once we can find all these very basic measures, we then just want to do them for subgroups, and that really can give us some interesting insights into data. We'll deal with a built-in data set called the CO2 data set. So this gives carbon dioxide uptake in grass plants. And so this is built into your background. So I've loaded in the tidyverse here, and now I'm going to convert the background object CO2 into a tibble. And then you can just see the top part of that tibble printed out below. And you can see that there are 5 variables: plant, type, and treatment. These are all categorical variables. And then concentration and uptake are both quantitative or numeric variables. And those are the two that we're going to be worried about summarizing here. All right, we want to just do some measures of center. Well, there's a mean function that will just take in a vector of data and output the mean of that vector. So for instance here, I'm taking that CO2 data set and I'm just grabbing the uptake column and I'm finding the mean of that. If you've heard of a trimmed mean, that's where you just cut off some of your outlying observations. This is a little bit more robust measure of center. You can add a trim option to the mean function. And then the median function, it's just median. And then again, you just give it the vector of data that you want. So here would be 2 measures of center for this particular variable. If we wanted to do our measures of spread, we talked about variance, standard deviation, and quartiles or quantiles more generally. And those can be found using these functions down here. Again, very simple. Var, give it the vector of interest. That gives us the sample variance. SD, vector of interest, that gives us the sample standard deviation of that column. There are fancier functions that will do a bunch of these things for us. So there's this summary function, which is really useful to get the 5-number summary as well as the mean. If you've ever made box plots, you know that there's a 5-number summary that we often look at, given by those numbers, and then the mean is often reported with it as well. An IQR function, which gives us the range of the middle 50% of the data. So the 0.75 quantile minus the 0.25 quantile. And there's a generic function for finding any quantiles. So this takes the uptake column and then giving it 2 probabilities. So 0.1 and 0.2 quantiles are the ones that I want. And so this is the value from the data set that has 10% of observations to the left of it. And this is the value from the data set from that column that has 20% of the observations below it. Again, you can see that finding these measures of spread and center are pretty straightforward and easy. We mentioned when we have 2 variables, the main thing that we want to look at would be the linear relationship. So covariance and correlation. And easily enough, COV gives us the covariance, COR gives us the correlation. The only things we need to give these functions would be the x and y variables that we want the covariance or correlation between. And so you can see here that we have probably what you'd consider a moderate positive correlation between these two variables. So we tend to see larger values of concentration with larger values of uptake. Mostly straightforward so far. Next up, it's, well, how do I do this for different subgroups of my data? You could sort of do it in a slower, naive way, which would be to subset your data, run the mean function on that, run the var function on that. Or you can have R just sort of do it all for you, which is the way that we want to do it. So what we're going to do is get the same statistics for the uptake variable, but by treatment. So going back to our data set, there were two treatments, chilled and non-chilled. And so what we want to do is find the mean, variance, etc. for each of those two groups. In R, there's a base R function. Remember, base R is what comes installed, called Aggregate. Function works really well, does a nice job. But we're going to stick with the tidyverse. Tidyverse is a little bit more limited, but stays with the same notation and everything that we've been dealing with. So we tend to like to do that. So we're going to use the dplyr package. Hopefully you'll have that installed. You just need to read that in. And then we're going to see two functions from dplyr, group by and summarize. So group by is going to define what variables we want to do the grouping on. And you can do more than one variable. And then summarize is going to allow us to create basic summaries from that. For instance, here's what you might do. So we're using chaining here. We're saying take the CO2 data set, then group it by the treatment variable, and then summarize and create three new variables. Average is the name of the first one, MED is the name of the second, and var is the name of the third. And with each one of these variables we're creating, we can give it one of these sort of basic functions that we just looked at. We can CO2 data set, group it by treatment, which is another variable from this data set, then summarize or create these three summary statistics, average, median, and variance. And you can see now we get those three values for each of our groups that treatment has. Again, not too bad. We can, of course, do more than one variable grouping. And so there's treatment in this data set and also type. So we can do group by treatment and type, and then summarize. And now we'll get all of the combinations of treatment and type together with their summary statistics. So you can see here in R, it's pretty easy to do a lot of really fun stuff. It is interesting to note when you see what's printed out here, this group by is actually adding essentially an attribute to this tibble. So it now has a grouping attribute called treatment, and there's actually two values of it, so it's both treatment and type. And so whenever R goes to do the summarize command, it looks for this group attribute first to determine whether it should just do the summaries for the entire data set or whether it should do the summaries for some grouping. And so there is a way to remove those groups as well. All right, but that pretty much wraps up numeric summaries for quantitative data. I will point you to the dplyr cheat sheet, very useful. When you go down here to the second page, you can see that there are summary functions. So that's exactly what we're using here. And you can use summarize with an S or Z, doesn't matter. But this is a function that takes vectors as input and returns a single value as output. So that's the real limiting thing about using the summarize function, is that it only returns a single value as output. There are other functions in R that you can do to return more fancy things, but here are some of the common ones that you want to do. Mean, we saw var, etc. There's also n to just count the number of values or rows, all these other kinds of things. So that's really useful. Next up, we're going to cover graphical summaries of ggplot2.